Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another motion debrief series brought to you by the Debaters Council of Sri Lanka. My name is Gavin Senaratne. I am a member of the engineering faculty debate team of the University of Moratual, and today I will be covering a motion from the 2024 Henley Debating Championships. The motion is this House would impose a digital data tax on tech companies proportional to the amount of user data that they collect and use. So let's go through this with proposition first and then opposition next. There's no need to switch around the sides. So the first thing that you do when you look at a this House would motion is you try to figure out what the problem is. Because a this House would motion means that you are implementing something, you are proposing a new solution, and for a new solution to be proposed, a problem must exist. So when you look at the motion, it seems pretty obvious that the problem that we are discussing is companies collecting your data. But that in itself is not really a problem, right? For example, the government also collects data. Let's slap a digital data tax on the government as well, right? If that's the case. I think the real problem is what these companies do with your data. And I think a lot of problem characterization probably needs to be done in this debate. I'll just set it out here, but you can maybe integrate it into the arguments as well. It really depends on your preference. So I guess the first issue that you have with companies collecting your data is that they take the data and they sell it to other outside merchants, and in turn they use this data for advertising or maybe for something else, right? We don't really know what they're using your data for. It could be for things that we can't even think of. I'll give you one example. Um, so as we know, Facebook has the right to collect your data, and so on and so forth. So one company in Russia used Facebook data to create an app called Girls Around Me. This was in like 2012. It was a big deal at the time. And what happened was it would basically track the Facebook accounts of women, track their location data, track their interests, and supply it to men who could then see who the girls were in their area, but also the interests of these girls and their location as well. So that's just one of the ways in which companies collecting your data can be used against you in a way that you can't really think of. So that's the first issue. The second issue, I guess, is with regards to choice and consent, because, well, one thing that we need to set up here is what kind of companies will be affected by this motion, right? When you think about collecting data, you think about social media companies, you think about companies like Google, but those are the obvious options, right? I think one option that maybe perhaps you all are unaware of, and that generally people are unaware of, is basically all apps and all websites collect your data in some way or form, right? This can be through cookies. This can also be like when you install an app, you give it certain permissions to track like private data on your phone, and as a consequence of that, they also have access to your data. This, I think, is one of the parts of the business model behind many free games that you play. So, for example, Angry Birds or Clash of Clans or whatever, they don't rely entirely on in-game purchases for their income. They also sell your data because they can track your location, the amount of time you spend on the apps, your spending habits on the apps, and so on and so forth. And most of this really is done without your consent, or specifically speaking, without your informed consent. Because you do give consent when you agree to the terms and conditions of these apps, but no one really reads it. And one problem is that companies deliberately make it difficult for you to go through the terms and conditions and understand your privacy violations that come about as a result of agreeing to those terms and conditions. I think there was one famous example. It was PayPal, if I'm not sure, but their terms and conditions were basically longer than Shakespeare's Hamlet. So that's just another fun fact for you. So there's an issue there, right? While you are consenting to the use of your data, companies have deliberately obscured the conditions that you are agreeing to, and as a consequence of that, you are not providing informed consent, and that in itself is a problem as well. Um, the third thing with companies collecting your data is that it's very difficult for governments to regulate and police it. One, because there's just so much data being collected, but also it's impractical for the government to investigate all the potential violations, and after investigating the potential violations, to prosecute companies that commit those violations, right? There have been high profile lawsuits where you've held like Facebook or Google accountable, but those have taken many, many years. It's cost billions of dollars. And during the time that you were prosecuting them for that one privacy violation, these companies have gone ahead and probably committed five others. And the fine isn't really a big deal for them as well. They can just pay it off and earn more. So it's very easy to characterize that a problem exists. And I guess the way you would go about just solving all those problems is you can implement a tax without a lot of these barriers, right? So I think realistically, this motion acts like a digital data fine, where you're fining tech companies for collecting and misusing your data. But ultimately, since you frame it as a tax, there's not an awful lot that they can do about it because the government has the freedom to dictate taxes however it wants, as evidenced by the tax policies of nations all over the world, including the one that we live in. So let's move on into the arguments and how you would go about building your case for this motion. So on proposition, I think the first thing that you need to look at is to try and understand how does a tax help solving this problem, right? One way is, you can kind of hold them accountable by getting money out of them for whatever thing that they're doing. But also, the way a tax becomes helpful is companies don't like paying taxes, right? This is just very straightforward. And the problem when you have to pay taxes for data collection is that data collection becomes less appealing. Now, what do I mean by this, right? Companies, like, why does Angry Birds collect and sell your data? Because it's profitable and they can get a lot of money out of it, and that's good for them. However, when the government starts imposing a digital data tax on Rovio, the company that produces Angry Birds, what that means is collecting and selling data becomes less profitable. So, as a consequence of that, what's going to happen is companies are going to be disincentivized to a certain extent from engaging in data collection, right? So, that's just one of the benefits that can come out of it. But this doesn't really apply for companies that have data collection and usage as their core business, right? Because ultimately they have no choice but to collect your data, because that's basically how their business functions, right? Google can't just stop collecting data. That's not really an option. So then you've got to visualize what's going to happen to companies that have data at their core business, and also other companies. But I think companies like Google or Facebook are going to be affected more by this. Usually, when a company faces a tax and their profits take a hit, they have an incentive to get the profits back up to the level it was. Now, why do companies want to maintain profits at the same level? It's pretty simple, right? They have a duty towards their shareholders to hold the value of their company. They want to be able to report that their profits are increasing, and so on and so forth. So, and if they don't show that their profits are increasing, or at the very least staying constant within expectations, that reduces investor confidence. People are less likely to invest in this company, people are more likely to sell their stock in this company, and that in turn hurts the shareholders. So, how will companies go about maintaining their profits at the same level? There are two ways that they can make up for the deficit. One, they can try and charge the users to make up for it. So this could be something like maybe you perhaps charging users for features that were previously free. So I don't know, maybe you put Instagram stories behind a paywall or something and let people only put posts for free, or something like that. The other way that you can go about it is by charging your customers, or in this case, the customers are the advertisers. You can charge extra from the customers to make up for the digital data tax that um, you are facing at the moment. And either way, you are going to start making your business less appealing to these individuals, right? Because one, these people are going to lose out on features, or two, they are going to have to pay more for the same service. So that's one way, right, that these apps become less appealing. However, if the apps choose not to increase the prices and they try to absorb the digital data tax, then what that's going to mean is, their profit margins are going to decrease. They're going to have less money to spend on long drawn out legal battles. They're going to have less money to spend on paying fines. So then government regulation becomes more effective. So either way, it's like a win-win situation. But it's very important for you to analyze the different ways in which a company can react to a particular policy, because that's very important, right? Unless you understand how the key stakeholders are going to react to your policy, you cannot really analyze the harms and benefits that might come about as a result of you implementing your policy. Now let's analyze the case where these companies decide to raise their prices, or they basically try to pass on the cost of the digital data tax onto the users. Well, then all the alternatives to these other companies becomes very attractive, right? Let's just compare Google to a pro-privacy web browser. say DuckDuckGo, for example, right? Let's say that Google kind of limits the options that you have when you're doing a Google search, or Google tries to charge a certain amount from you when you are using the browser. In that case, a pro-privacy browser like DuckDuckGo, even though it's an inferior browser to Google, even though it doesn't get the search results as well, becomes more attractive because you don't have to face all of those other like features on Google that worsen the user experience. On the other hand, if you look at it from the user side, right, from the advertiser side, why don't advertisers advertise on search engines like DuckDuckGo? The reason is simple, because it doesn't engage in all this data collection and data usage, and because it doesn't have these options like highly targeted advertising, they are not attractive options to advertisers, right? And so what happens if Google tries to raise its price for the advertising side of things, um, to cover the cost of the digital tax? When that happens, the other options like DuckDuckGo become more attractive, because even though they provide a somewhat worse service, they are still going to be much cheaper. And here's like the critical distinction, right? Um, these pro-privacy options, companies that respect your data, can't operate at high profit margins, because ultimately their advertising or whatever product that they propose to advertisers is going to be inferior to the product that you have from Google. And they can't really compete on cost because they don't have the same economies of scale as a company like Google or Facebook does either. So in that case, you make the market more competitive for these pro-privacy options by putting the digital data tax, basically leveling the playing field. And from there onwards, it's pretty standard analysis as to why having more options is good for people. So I won't really go into that. So that's the second aspect of it when it comes to pro-privacy options. But I also think there's just a simple argument to be made about awareness. And this is somewhat debatable, but I think it's worth making the argument, which is that once you start implementing a digital data tax and companies are forced to make all these changes and in these ways that they react to a policy, there is going to be a greater degree of awareness, one regarding your privacy, your digital data, and two, also how you manage that privacy and like what apps to use, and you get a greater awareness of these other like pro privacy options that are available for you as well. And there's just the simple question of why exactly awareness is important, and I think it's pretty straightforward on that front, because this question on companies collecting and using your data has existed for 2-3 decades at least, and there still hasn't really been any kind of significant progress regarding it. So you need to like drive as much awareness as possible to the individuals who agree to these options and who just simply give up their data. um, I think you can also make an argument about how there's a necessity for the government to step in simply on the basis that people are stupid. And like just hark back to the example that I gave you about girls around us. Like there is no way that an individual who's sitting at home and gives consent to Facebook to collect their data could have thought that it would end up, going out to a Russian company where they sell your data to people who allow then predators to track you through an app, right? So people are unaware of like seeing this big picture and what could potentially be done with their data. They think, look, I'm an insignificant individual. What difference does it make if they have my data or not? And I think now it's very critical for governments to step in, simply because their people are unaware of the harms that can be done to them through companies collecting and using their digital data. So those are like three main broad areas that I want to focus on for side proposition. And now let's move on to side opposition, right? So again, on side opposition, it's a this house wood motion. You have a few strategies, right? Um, One, you can look at the problem and say, look, this problem doesn't exist. You can say that companies collecting and using data is not a problem. People are adults, they can consent to it, yada, yada, yada. Or you can say that this method of like this particular solution that you are implementing for the digital data problem is not an effective or viable solution, and therefore you shouldn't go about with it. It'll probably end up doing more harm than good. So how do you go about analyzing this? I think the first important thing, same as for proposition, is for opposition to look at it and try and understand how companies will react and frame the reaction of these companies in a favorable way for themselves. So again, on opposition, look, these companies, they don't like being taxed. They do whatever they can to avoid it. They pass on the cost to the consumers, but also there's just straight up tax evasion, right? And this is something that proposition probably doesn't want to bring into the debate in their own speech, but proposition will have to respond to later on. So companies are basically going to try and avoid paying the digital data tax, right? And they're going to try to like hide the amount of data that they collect. They're not going to report it well, and so on and so forth. So, what are the problems that come about as a consequence of that? Well, one, you get the regulation problem all over again, right? Earlier, you couldn't regulate these companies because they can simply absorb the fines, they'll draw out the court cases and whatnot. The same problem applies here. How are you going to track how much user data is collected and used by these companies? I think one straightforward way of going about it is to say, look, you can regulate and monitor the advertiser side of things, so you can very easily track how much data is being bought from Google, and through that way you can try and understand how these companies are collecting and using data. But I still think it's a very valid argument to make on opposition that companies are going to try to evade detection. They're going to try to evade the digital data tax, and they're probably going to think of some way to do it that I'm not smart enough to think of. So then it becomes question of why is companies trying to evade the digital data tax so harmful? I think one is that when you don't have a clear idea of how much data is being collected, how that data is being used, it's very hard for legislation regarding data privacy to evolve. And this is a problem that we've always had, right? Because the internet is growing at an exponential pace, you have AI and stuff like that coming up, and governments are always two steps behind when it comes to legislation to regulate these various services offered by these tech companies. And now what's going to happen is once you give these tech companies a direct incentive to hide their activities from you, to hide how they're collecting data and what they're using that collected data for, it's simply going to set your legislation even one step further back. And you can like bring up examples of how countries are succeeding at the moment. I think the best example is the EU. They've passed a lot of policies regulating tech companies. I think there was one famous policy again regarding cutting down on these terms and conditions and making it more readable and understandable for individuals. So that's just one particular policy that you have when it comes to the tech sector. And there are more policies you can research on this. But simply speaking, governments have been caught up in this endless cycle of catching up to the degree of innovation that tech companies show. And this will simply set governments back even further when it comes to the idea of legislation. And that companies are simply going to evade it. They're not going to be affected by it to a large extent. Now, this brings us to the second level. Okay, fine. They don't engage in illegal activities such as evading detection. They'll go through with it in the legal way. They'll pass their tax on to the consumers or whatever, but still this is going to be a bad thing. How do you end up analyzing this? Well, first, I think you can analyze it from the user side when it comes to individuals. And again, there's another choice argument to be made here, right? You dispute the problem saying that it's not that people don't really know about it. There has been plenty of awareness about it, but people simply don't care. And if people don't care, the government doesn't really need to step in. So there's probably going to be a clash here on whether, should the government let the people do whatever they want as long as they consent to it, or should the government step in at some point and say, look, no more data, no more consenting to companies collecting your private data for you. You are not rational enough to make this decision. The problem is that if users don't really care about their data and they just want to use this service that's really good, by the way, for free, then the government is infringing upon the rights of the users by A, making the product more inferior since now companies are disincentivized from collecting data, B, making the product more expensive since the company wants to pass the tax on to the customers, or C, driving these customers towards other pro-privacy options that are also going to give them a worse experience. And so for these reasons, it's very likely that users are not going to be happy with however the company reacts to the policy being passed. And so therefore the company will probably continue collecting their data and also pay off the tax. But the ultimate benefit, the ultimate consequence of this is that users will end up having a worse experience. You can flip this for the business side of things as well, right? If the company tries to cover the digital data tax by charging more from its advertisers, who exactly is going to be affected by this to a larger extent, right? If you're thinking about billion-dollar companies, if you're thinking about like Walmart or Amazon or whatever, these extremely large companies that have a dedicated user base, that have brand recognition, companies like, I don't know, Coca-Cola, Nestle, so on and so forth, they're not really going to be affected by having to pay more for targeted advertisements, or B, not having access to targeted advertisements and having to opt for options that are less targeted, right? These brands are still going to survive, they're still going to thrive. Who is going to be affected by this to a large extent? Take a moment and think about it, right? Who advertises a lot using social media advertisements and who depends on it a lot to grow their businesses? And if you can't be bothered to think about that, the answer is you have like small businesses, right? You have entrepreneurs. You have these online retailers that operate at a small scale that sell cookies or clothes or jewelry or whatever. These businesses depend a lot on this targeted advertising to make sure that their product is seen by the highest number of people who are potentially interested in that product, and they don't have the funds to cast a wide net and try and meet 100,000 customers through these social media platforms. So now these small businesses are going to be negatively impacted because their strategy for acquiring customers is A, lost, or B, has become more expensive. It cut down into their profits. So once again, you're trying to target the big tech companies that are misusing your data. Ultimately, the people you end up harming are going to be small businesses who depend on these tools to grow their business or whatever. The ultimate consequence of that is you're going to worsen lives. And I think on the business side, there's another argument to be made on how users actually like the recommendations that they get from these social media companies, that they actually enjoy the highly targeted advertisements that they receive, because at the end of the day, they get a better experience, they get a better shopping experience, they get a better social media experience, and so on and so forth. So the way the ultimate consequence of the argument is that you want to place a burden on tech companies, but ultimately that burden gets passed on to users and other small businesses, and therefore you worsen their lives in general, ultimately failing in your objectives as a government. The final point that I want to cover on side opposition is again when it comes to businesses, but this is with regards to the businesses in the tech sector. Because once again, it's very unlikely that you're going to harm big tech companies like Google. They'll innovate, they'll figure some way to get around it, right? They'll either evade it or they'll absorb the tax or whatever. And whatever the incentives are, it's very unlikely to think that Google will crash and fail because of it. But what about all the other companies in the tech sector that depend on data collection and usage as their core business, right? I mean, this point about the core business is very important here. Think of perhaps a new search engine, a new AI startup, or a new social media application, or whatever, right? Or I don't know, maybe some facial recognition software that relies on collecting what faces look like in order to build their facial recognition model. These businesses are going to be hit with like the same digital data tax that companies like Google will be facing. And here you have like a scaling problem, right? If in fact the data tax is proportional to the amount of data that you collect and use, what that means is that if you have Google and if you have a small startup collecting the same amount of data, it's if you set it to the amount where the small startup can afford it, it's not going to do anything to Google. If you set it to the level where Google will be impacted by it, then the small startup is going to be impacted by it to a larger extent. Basically, the ultimate argument here is that you are going to stifle innovation happening in the tech sector because companies that rely on data collection and usage as their core business are going to face a massive cost right at the outset. And it becomes a question here like there's a piece of analysis here which is somewhat economic analysis, that at the start of your business you can't bear large costs, right? Because you're running on debt, you're not making a profit, anyway you're operating at a loss. This just piles on top of that loss that you're facing at the moment. And so if you don't have new innovation and new startups in the tech sector, what that means is you have less people to challenge these tech giants, you have less people to challenge the big tech corporations, and as a consequence of that, it's going to be even more difficult to regulate the market, and they're not going to face competition, and you have all the harms of having no competition as well in there. So then the ultimate consequence of the argument is that you are going to negatively impact innovation and startups within the tech sector as opposed to the big tech companies that you're trying to target. So those are the arguments that I had for side opposition as well. Obviously, there is more argumentation that can be made within this debate. It has a very, very, very large scope. Um, if you all have any ideas, comment them down below. I say this in every video, but people don't do it. That's completely fine. So I hope all of you learned something from it. I hope you all got a different perspective into the tech sector and economics and technology. And I hope that you all have a great day.